Hello everyone, and welcome back. If you're new here, I'm Douglas Johnson. I'm an ordained minister, yoga, meditation, non-dual spirituality teacher, and a certified Kilobeat inquiries facilitator. So what are we here to discuss today? Well, this relates with a few talks that I've given in the past few weeks about having a high baseline, raising your baseline, how you can help others, what the world needs from you. So this is, you might say, a clarification of things that I've mentioned in those talks. So this is related with those, and I recommend you go watch those 3 videos if you haven't already, because what I'll be discussing today will relate with what I've discussed previously. But if you just want to watch this talk, hopefully it will be clear enough on its own. You won't have to have seen those prior videos in order to understand. So very simply, let me get the message out here right at the beginning. What the world needs from you, what your children need from you more than anything, what your spouse needs from you more than anything, what the planet, the environment, what the political landscape, whatever you care about, whatever your pet project is in life, whether it's taking care of your children, whether it's cultivating a loving relationship with your significant other, whether it is helping to save the planet, save the world, whether it is trying to create social change. From my perspective, from the spiritual perspective, from the awake, embodied perspective, what the world needs from you is to have a very high baseline. It needs you, you might say, vibrating at the highest potential that you have to vibrate. I know that might sound a little new agey, so you can put the vibration talk aside if you want. You need a very high emotional baseline. You need to wake up with joy and peace in your heart. You need to be seeing and experiencing heaven on this plane of existence, on this earth. I know that logically there are lots of problems. That's why spirituality is not about logic, folks. I've studied logic. I've studied philosophy in university. I know what logic is. I know how to be logical, okay? And that is not what spirituality is about. Spirituality is not necessarily about being illogical, but it is trans-logic. It goes beyond what we can rationally understand with our rational mind, with the dualistic mind, okay? So again, you please have to forgive me for doing my job, which is I am a spiritual teacher. I am not a logic teacher. I am not a philosophy teacher. I'm not here to always make sense. But hopefully, if I'm doing my job well, I am connecting with spirit inside of you, what in A Course in Miracles they call Holy Spirit. And that spirit is responding to my words. In fact, your mind might even object, but yet you might feel that in your heart or your gut, something is resonating, something is making sense. And I hope that that is the case. So what the world needs from you, what your children need from you, what your spouse needs from you, what your spiritual community needs from you, what your students need from you, what your government needs from you. Take your pick. Take your pick. It needs you at your best. And you are at your best when your emotional tone is high, when you are at a high baseline. This is what the world needs from you right now. There are so many forces at play, and I'm not talking about conspiracy theory here. I'm not talking about some evil force trying to drag you down. This is just ignorance. we human beings, we just know so little about reality, spiritual reality, real reality. We have all these stories that we believe that are not ultimately true, but very few of us question these stories. I need a lot of money to be happy. I need to do what other people tell me to do to make them happy. I need to sacrifice to do what's necessary. All of these things we just don't question. We just take it as a truth, as a gospel. And these things are not true ultimately. But as a result of believing them, many of us, our baseline is being dragged down into the mud. And because everyone else's baseline is so low, when we look around and we measure ourselves against others, we tend to think, well, this is normal. This is the human condition. This is what being an adult is all about. This is what adulting is about, right? Being miserable, sucking it up, and just dealing with the misery and the unpleasantness of being an adult and being alive and having responsibilities. I'm going to invite you to reject that narrative, because that narrative and that idea is feeding into the very problems that you probably wish would disappear. Again, if you want peace on earth, if you want justice, if you want fairness, if you want any of these things, this is how you actually get it. By feeding your own spirit, by raising your own baseline. It isn't by sacrificing for the greater good somehow, giving up your own sense of well-being, your own connection with spirit, that's somehow going to bring it. I know that these ideas are out there. I know that they are even very popular. It's a very common narrative because it actually comes from the ego. And the fact of the matter is most people are identified with ego. And it makes a lot of sense to the ego. I need to sacrifice in order to better the world. I need to give up happiness, joy, peace for my children, for my cause. It's called martyrdom. And it's a very common, mistaken, you might say, idea that shows up in spirituality. Now, I'm not saying there isn't a place for sacrifice, for giving up in spirituality. It can be a very powerful principle when applied skillfully in the right situation with the right frame of mind. But I'm not here to discuss this today because I feel that most people are actually too gung-ho about this without maybe thinking of it in those terms. You may not think of yourself as a martyr, and yet you may take it as a given that, oh, I need to sacrifice for my children to be well-educated and to be well-rounded people and to have what they truly need in life. I need to work many, many, many hours and suffer and bring home this huge paycheck just so that their needs are taken care of. And again, I'm not here to discuss specifics, everyone, as I've said many, many times. That is not, if you want to talk specifics, you're going to need to reach out to me and we can talk about your specific situation, okay? But I'm talking in generalizations, and generally speaking, that isn't what we're needing. And we're at a very interesting time in human development. As spiritual teacher Eckhart Tolle has pointed out, and I agree with him, we're at a time when many people are waking up. They're having real spiritual awakenings, like they're really seeing the truth. And yet, because of a lack of education in the spiritual community around embodiment, many of these people are waking up and then getting very, very confused. I can attest to this myself, because when I woke up, if anything, I was more confused than before. I may have had in the past no sense about reality, about truth. I was living very much by what we would call egoic ideas and standards. That's all I really knew. But once I had my awakening, the ego was still functioning, even though maybe it was in the background to some degree, but it still could create a lot of problems, wreak a lot of havoc, and it did. It created a lot of suffering. And if anything, the awakening confused me more. There was, in a sense, more clarity around certain subjects and ideas, and again, sort of ultimate truth and reality, but how that played out in this realm as a human being, as a male living in the 21st century, it did not add up. It did not make sense. It was very challenging, very difficult to get my bearings and to know what was the right thing to do in many circumstances. Unfortunately for me, I did not find the guidance that I needed. I had teachers, but when I turned to them, unfortunately, they were not able to help me. And I don't want to paint that as their fault or their shortcoming. This is just what happened for whatever reason. And I tend to believe and experience that everything happens for the ultimate good. So that perhaps led me to rely on myself more. And it also perhaps led me to seek other teachers who taught me other things. And so I can say I am the teacher I am today because my teachers weren't able to help me. Do I look at them and see that they lack in any way or that there's something wrong with them? No, absolutely not. I think that they are perfect just as they are, and they may do a perfect job of guiding others, maybe even most people, to the state that I'm describing, but that is not what happened for me. So I really wanted today's talk to clarify this because I feel like I was not clear in the last few talks. I sort of talked about, well, you need to take care of yourself first before you help others. I talked about having a high baseline, raising your baseline up. So I've spoken about many different aspects, but I don't feel like I've been very, very clear. So again, I'm going to repeat it many times in today's talk. What the world needs from you is for you to take your baseline, your default emotional state, and to raise that up as high as you possibly can. Now, as I mentioned in another talk where I touched on this, this is not advocating for hedonism. This is not saying, oh, do what you want, make yourself happy. Oh, you like Star Wars? Well, binge watch Star Wars. You like cake? Then go ahead and eat lots of cake. Oh, you like massages? Go and get as many massages as you want. Ignore your children, ignore your job, ignore your spouse. This is absolutely not what I am advocating for. Again, like most things in spirituality, these messages are often misunderstood. And again, if you are listening to this and you are confused or you are not sure if you are understanding me, reach out. Let's have a session one-on-one. Let's do a private session where we discuss the specifics of your situation and we clarify what this might mean in your life. This is very, very important as far as I'm concerned right now for where we are. We desperately need people who have a high emotional tone as their default, because the news, the media, basically everyone is pointing to how bad everything is. And yes, again, I am not here to deny the reality of it seems like there's a lot of things that need improvement that hopefully in the future we can address as human beings. But here's the main point of my message. You being miserable is not going to fix any of those things. This is a very common belief, unconscious belief. So again, we don't look and stop and slow down and really examine our mind and our thoughts. But many people, on some level, they will say to themselves unconsciously, well, the world's really messed up, and I'm not going to be able to be happy. I cannot have a high baseline until there is social justice in the world. As long as there are people who are suffering, as long as there are people who are treating others unjust, I am not going to allow myself to have a high emotional baseline or tone. Now, as I mentioned in my last talk, I think Gandhi, Martin Luther King are two great examples of people who had high emotional tones, high emotional baselines, and yet they were able to recognize things could use improving. So they were activists, they were social reformers, and guess what? They were successful. Every generation produces activists and social reformers. How successful are they? How many of them do we know their names? And yet we know about Gandhi, we know about Martin Luther King. Why do we know about them? Again, they were men of faith. Both of them had their roots deeply in spirituality. Yes, they were different spiritual traditions. As most of you know, I'm an ordained minister. I am a minister who crosses lines of denomination and those types of separation, because I don't experience those. I don't see those. I see those as an impediment, a barrier. And I have a feeling if Martin Luther King and Gandhi were to sit down and talk, they would find a lot more in common than they did differences. So the Course in Miracles points this out very well when it talks about form versus content. The content of the Bhagavad Gita, of the Bible, of the Upanishads, if we really can get into what is the message, what is this pointing to, we find the content is the same. The form, the outward expression will always be different. This is the nature of this plane of existence, of this reality that we live in. The form of my body, of my expression, of my words will be different than yours. But at our deepest core, we are the same, okay? At our deepest core, we are the same. That unnameable, ineffable part of ourselves that we truly are, this is the same in everyone and everything. As far as I've experienced, as far as I can tell, as far as my teachers and the traditions that I study point to. So again, not just my opinion, my experience, and also the experience of others who have come before me. So I hope you will hear this message and this talk as it is intended. The greatest thing that you can do for the world right now, for your children, for their future, for your grandchildren, for the future generations, for your boss, for your spouse, for your parents, for everybody, is to raise your baseline as high as you can. Now, here's the other part of this talk that I need to give, because this is an important thing. you may think that, okay, I'm doing this for my children, so that means they're going to thank me and they're going to appreciate what I'm doing and they're going to see what I'm doing. No. Okay? Unfortunately, that is not the way it works. So some people who are used to you with a low baseline, low emotional tone, that's the person they're used to, that's the person they relate with, that's the person that they maybe can manipulate and get what they want from. When you raise your baseline, because one of the things that happens when you raise your baseline is people can't manipulate you as easily. There's so much joy and peace and happiness that other people trying to guilt you or shame you, over time it stops working very well. And you just sort of see what people are doing, the games that they're playing, and you're less likely to play into that. So someone who's used to manipulating you in that way, they will not like the new you. In fact, they might very well criticize you for what you're doing and say, oh, you're being selfish. You need to stop this immediately. You need to go back to taking care of this or that thing. Another thing I should mention here as a warning is as you begin to focus on raising your baseline and succeeding in doing that, certain things may begin to fall away. You might find yourself less motivated to do certain things, and this is usually a good thing. Okay, again, I can't speak in every instance. Okay, your specifics may vary. Sometimes this can go too far. But oftentimes what's happening, if things are working the way they should, fear is dropping away. Fear, guilt, shame, these things are losing their grip on us. As they do, the things that we did because we were afraid, because we were shamed into doing them, because we were made to feel guilty, because we were emotionally blackmailed to doing them, we're going to find that we just don't want to do those things anymore. So this may include work, the type of work that you're doing, the amount of money that you're making, social events, things that your to-do list, your huge to-do list of, I need to call this person and make sure that they're happy with me. I need to call that person and make sure that, they know that I care about them. I need to do this work so I can make all that money, so I can have my huge nest egg, so I can feel safe. Again, as you raise your baseline, very often an innate sense of safety, peace comes over you, and things like health insurance, a huge house, a huge bankroll, lots of money in the bank, all these things start to mean less and less to you, and this can be very scary. Again, and this is one of the reasons why I always encourage you to reach out, touch base, talk with me if you're going through one of these experiences, as these can be very normal and to be expected. Having said that, there can be things that go wrong. So sometimes something that looks like a spiritual thing of letting go may actually be giving in to fear and allowing fear to guide us. My inquiry teacher, Scott Killaby, he talks a lot about how many people end up in what's called a spiritual bypass by overemphasizing what's called the void state and identification with the void. And in the tradition that I studied, the Zen tradition, that was the main non-dual tradition that I studied, they're very careful about not allowing one to do that. So a very common statement in non-dual communities might be like, well, there's no one here, there's nothing to do. You're trying to criticize Douglas, but Douglas isn't here, right? This can be a true realization that people have. They might realize that the whole idea of a person, a personhood, an individual is actually asinine. I know that may not make sense to all of you, and that's fine. This is a realization that we have when we're ready. And if you're interested in that realization, understanding what I'm talking about, then again, you can reach out. This is something that we can work on together. It's called direct pointing, where I try and point out your true nature and help you to realize your true nature. But this can also be a bypass. And in the Zen tradition, they say, not one, not two. Because that perspective of oneness, emptiness, voidness, while it can be very seductive and true in a sense, I'm not denying that, it's not the whole truth. Which is why Zen says not one, not two. So the fact of the matter is, yes, I may have a non-dual realization of truth and oneness, and yet the fact of the matter is my life is a total disaster. I'm not able to hold down a job. I'm not able to relate with those who love me. I'm not able to own up to my own deficiencies or problems. I just try and ignore them or spiritualize them away by saying, well, there's no one here to criticize. There's no one here to do anything. You want me to change, but there's nobody here. That's when usually, if you were working with an old school Zen master, she would pick up her kyosaku, her blow of compassion, her stick, and she would hit you with it very hard, so you were in a lot of pain. Then when you were like, ow, why did you hit me? She would say, if there's no one here, who's in pain? Who's complaining about this, right? Very, very skillful teaching, actually. Again, I know modern times, we're too squeamish to imagine a teacher hitting us. We just immediately want to yell abuse and run away. But these teachings were so powerful and they worked so well. Again, these come from another time and another place, may not be appropriate in today's day and age. I know that I've never struck a student or hit a student, but the message is still there. That point is still there, that this student is not really seeing the big picture, the whole picture. She's limited herself to certain spiritual tropes. Now, this usually happens because of the unconscious, the shadow, and what my inquiry teacher Scott calls dark matter. And so these are the unseen parts of the self. We might have unresolved trauma. We might have unresolved emotional baggage. We may have relationships that ended very poorly, and we still feel somehow affected by that, deficient, unworthy, and we're not sure how to resolve that, how to fix that, how to come to terms with what happened. And so we turn to spirituality as a way of escaping what we feel, because we don't like what we feel. We don't like what we're feeling, what it makes us think about us, right? So if I feel deficient, if I feel unworthy, if I feel guilty, if I feel ashamed, we don't like feeling this. So what Scott points out is many people will be drawn actually to spiritual teachings, teachers, and forms of spirituality that allow them to bypass the most painful parts of themselves. Okay, so again, non-duality, if I have a lot of trauma in my past, a lot of things I don't want to look at in the human, then identifying as oneness, emptiness, shunyata, nothingness, as spirit with no form, no location. Identifying with that is a very appealing idea, because all my pain, all my trauma, all my childhood memories that are so painful, those can all be pushed aside as not real. That's the human baggage, and I'm not that. I'm spirit. Very lofty again, but the fact of the matter is the human is still alive. She's still breathing. She still goes to work. She still interacts with her children. She still interacts with her spouse. She still gets in a bad mood. She still gets grumpy. She still will shout or scream or say something inappropriate at the wrong time. She still will suffer. These are not inconsequential facts. These are not small things to be ignored. These are very, very important. And as I've spoken about in the past, this is the work of what we call embodiment. Some of you have listened to my talk, first wake up and then clean up. So cleaning up is the work of embodiment. All that human stuff that we can say is from the past, really the past and the future don't exist, not in the way we humans conceptualize them, but all that stuff that seems to be from the past, these images, these stories, these thoughts, these feelings that show up in my body, these have to be met skillfully, intelligently. And there are really a few ways that we can meet them that I've spoken about in the past, but I'll very quickly address them. One is the right kind of meditation, okay? If you'd like to learn meditation with me, I have some free instruction on the Patreon page, on the YouTube page. It's there. But you can also reach out to me one-on-one or wait for a meditation retreat, meditation workshop. But not all meditation is created equal. I'm not saying I teach the best kind, but I do teach the kind that is going to address what I'm talking about. So doing a guided meditation with your phone on an app is not necessarily the meditation I'm speaking of. That still may be very useful and very good for you. It's just not what I'm speaking of, and it probably will not deliver the results I'm speaking of. So in meditation, these unseen parts of the self are given an opportunity to rise into conscious awareness. And it is in conscious awareness, in the present, that things can be resolved. And this is a very important point. We can't deal with the past in the past. The past is over, if you want to say. But what troubles us is not the past. What troubles us is the way the past presents in the present, right? As a feeling, as a thought, as a sense of guilt, as a sense of shame, however it shows up for us. It's in the present that we suffer. It's not in the past. We may have had a lot of pain in the past, but we are suffering now. That's what is important, okay? So meditation, one way of beginning to turn toward this human part of ourselves. Yoga Nidra, Sankalpa especially, if we identify areas where we want to make changes, very often through meditation, we can identify, okay, I have this sense of lack. We can work with what's called Sankalpa in Yoga Nidra and begin to work on changing that over time with regular practice. Then there's Kundalini work. Again, not Kundalini yoga, but Kundalini work that I teach. Energetic work, okay? Working with the energies of the body with very powerful techniques to dislodge and to bring up these deficiency stories, these painful aspects of the self, to bring them up, bring them again into conscious awareness, and allow the conscious awareness and the energies, the life energies, to resolve these things for us. And then the final one I'll mention that I've been mentioning a lot lately, again, is inquiry. Inquiry, again, is something that I've always done. I didn't have that name for it, but it's just something I did. But I never could figure out a way to systemize it, to teach it to others, to share it with others. And this is one of the things I'm so grateful to my inquiry teacher, Scott Killaby, for, is he helped teach me a method through which I can systematically help another and teach another systematically how to work on their own, ultimately, should you want to do that. So when all these other tools fail, if they should fail, and they may not, inquiry will be your lifeline. When you've been meditating and yet you're still suffering, when you've been working with your sankalpa and yet you still find yourself irritated in a certain situation, when you've done the Kundalini work and yet you still find yourself triggered in a certain situation, this is where inquiry is very skillful, because it is like spiritual surgery. We can pinpoint a specific issue that you have, a specific thing that you have. I'm bothered when this person says this. Okay, we can get that specific. When my boss does this, it makes me feel small and worthless, and I suffer because of that. We can take that very situation and dig into it and find the roots in the ego that are creating that suffering. That's a great way of thinking of it, that suffering will always have roots, and it will have roots in the ego. Some of these roots are very deep, and many of them go back to childhood or early developmental issues that we had along the way as children. It's just part of being human. It doesn't mean your parents did it wrong. It doesn't mean your parents were evil. It doesn't mean they didn't have your best interests in mind. It just means your parents were human. Humans are imperfect, and most of us have not received education on what I'm talking to you about today. So your parents were doing the best they can. They may have been very ignorant of the damage they may have been taking part in creating. And this is an important point that I do want to just mention here. I don't want to get too far into it today, but our parents may have played a role in what was created, but we also play a role. So that's all I'm really going to say about it. I'm not trying to blame a victim here. So please hear me and understand what I'm saying. But part of digging ourselves out of any hole that we're in is believing that we have strength and power. So part of the way we understand ourselves to have strength and power is to recognize that if we're so strong and powerful, then how did these people cause this suffering, create this suffering? The answer is they didn't do it alone. They did it with our cooperation. And again, I know some people may not like hearing that, and that's fine. But this is an important spiritual principle to eventually come to grips with. I was counseling someone recently who actually had taken this principle and kind of used it almost for self-abuse. And so this is again where these are nuanced points, and they need to land properly. And they often don't, but I still have to talk about them. There's a great Zen book that was popular when I was at the Zen Center back in the 90s, and kind of first learning about Zen, and it was called You Have to Say Something. And I love that because it spoke so much to my realization, where the realization that I had was so profound, there was no way I could put that into words. I didn't even know if I could share it with anybody. It it just was beyond everything. It didn't make logical sense. It was this, it was everything and it was nothing. I know that sounds very kind of like spiritual nonsense, but if you've experienced what I'm talking about, you understand this actually makes spiritual sense. And so how do you talk about that? How do you share that with somebody? So I almost found myself like stuck, like a deer in the headlights. Like, this isn't, we can't talk about this. Anything I say about it is going to cheapen it. It's going to create confusion. It's going to send people off in the wrong direction. And I was absolutely right. This is the truth. I do this for a living, and I know people misunderstand me all the time. I say something and it lands in the wrong way. They don't get it. So this is the reality. A teacher I like said, my job as a spiritual teacher is to fail and fail well. He's saying basically, he knows he can't do the job that's been assigned to him, which is to talk about spirit, to point to spirit, to have people understand. And yet, this book was saying you have to say something. If you think that this realization, you can just sit on it. And I actually think one of the signs of a true awakening is the desire to share it with others despite the impossibility of the task. This isn't just for me. I'll have you know, the greats have been just as misunderstood, misquoted as me. I'd say one of the greatest spiritual teachers who ever probably was embodied and lived on this planet is, in my opinion, Jesus Christ. And such a great teacher that, again, in his own tradition, is considered the Son of God, right? God, he's equally human and equally divine. And I'd say this is accurate, but the thing you may not realize is this is also true of yourself. This is true of all of God's creation, including Jesus, but including everything else, including people you don't like. Now, a lot of times we don't like people because they are actually in their own mind disconnected from spirit, from the divine. They don't know their own divinity. But this goes back to what I was saying earlier in another talk about helping others. How do you truly help others? It's to know your own divinity. And then when you know your own, when you really hold it, you can hold it for others. And this again goes back to the point of today's talk, which is raise your baseline up as high as you can. Feel the joy of divinity coming through you. Okay? There's a great quote from the 80s film, and I suppose it's a quote of an actual historical figure because the film is it's based on history. Chariots of Fire. Some of you will remember it. Some of you probably never heard of it. I think it's a good film. It's worth watching. It has a classic soundtrack by the late great composer, Vangelis, Greek composer, film composer, a pioneer in electronic music. Anyway, this film, in it, there's a gentleman who is just a freak of nature. He's a Scottish man, and he can just sprint so incredibly fast. And there's this wonderful quote in the film where he says, "When I run, I feel God's joy." He said, "God put me here to run. And when I run, I feel God's joy." So this is what I'd like you to experience every day of your life. When you breathe, when you eat, when you walk, when you talk, when you interact with other people. I want you to feel God's joy, your divinity coming through you, shining through you, exuding through every pore, the joy, that deep sense of peace. This is what I hope to share with you. And all of the tools that I share, all of the things that I try and educate you about taking care of your body, diet, health, fasting, sleep, walking, exercising, all of it plays into what we're talking about. Many people try and just deal with everything with one thing. They try and meditate all their problems away, and yet they have a poor diet and they don't exercise. Or they try and exercise all their problems away, and yet they have a poor diet and they don't deal with their stress with meditation. Other people will try and inquiry everything away and just inquire in everything, and again, but they aren't sleeping well, they aren't taking care of their health, they're not eating right, and other things, they're not exercising maybe. In my opinion, this approach does not and will not work. A human being is a whole organism, okay? And again, please don't come at me with some exception. What about Stephen Hawking? He couldn't move. Okay, if you can't move, then I'm just going to assume you're not meant to. But you're not Stephen Hawking, okay? You're not this genius brain stuck in this basically decrepit, dying body. That's not your story. You have a relatively healthy body. Chances are, if you're listening to this, okay? And if you don't, again, reach out. We can talk specifics, okay? There are recommendations that can be made for exceptions to the rule. But for most people, they have a healthy human body that needs to be used. They are going to eat. You are eating. You will eat. So what you eat, when you eat, how much you eat, these are things that need to be considered. Again, stress, it's just a reality. It's a part of our life. How do we handle that? Are we meditating? Are we doing yoga nidra? Are we doing our yoga practice in a way that's going to help us feel, again, grounded, peaceful? These are important. And then if we're taking care of all that stuff and yet we find there's still this cloud following us around, then our deficiency story, inquiry, looking into what we could call the past and digging up these beliefs that continue to run and function and cast a cloud over our present experience. As far as I'm concerned, none of these things should be off of your radar if you want a high baseline. And again, I think personally, as a spiritual teacher, there's no greater gift you can give to the world right now. And when I say the world, again, that includes your children, it includes your spouse, it includes your parents. Then you raise your baseline absolutely as high as you can. Will they thank you for it? Maybe not. In fact, like I said earlier, some people may resent you for it. But in a strange way, they'll have to respect you. They may complain, they may do whatever, but it doesn't matter. What you'll find is when you raise your baseline, certain people will fall out of your life very naturally, and other people will find you. And those people that find you when you have a high baseline, those are your people. That is your tribe. That is who you want to be around. The people who are around you when you have a low baseline, drawn to you when you have a low baseline, even those, please hear me, even those who are trying to help you, sometimes those are not the people you want around you. Now, please understand this. I've talked about this a little bit before, but some people's ego gets fed by helping you. That is part of their ego identity. So if when you are down, so-and-so is always around to save the day and to help you, you might think, oh, thank God for this person. And yet, how do they treat you when you're up? Are they cheering for you? Are they rooting for you? Are they with you? Or is there some strain in the relationship? Again, I'm not talking specifics, so these are nuanced things, but it's worth noting. Sometimes the people who gather around us, even the ones who claim to be helping us, when we are down, when we are in our low vibration, sometimes these are not the people that we want to be around. That's not our tribe. They're not going to embrace us at our highest baseline, at a high vibration. They just will not, because they were getting fed by believing they are the savior. They are the one helping you, saving you, fixing you, whatever it is. So just be mindful of this. This is a reality for some people. So this is something I've talked about before in relation to retreats and me as a teacher in this community. It's my hope to share everything that I know and everything that I've learned with you. And in essence, for you to have everything that I have and to experience everything I'm experiencing. And so some people might think, oh, well, okay. I go to Doug when I'm down, when I need to figure out how to raise my baseline. I go on the retreats to learn and to get, fix things of that nature. Once have a high baseline, once everything's fixed, then I don't have a need for spirituality anymore. I don't have a need for Doug as a teacher. I don't have a need for Mahapatha Yoga community. Well, if you're understanding what I'm saying, and if I'm doing my job right, when your vibration is at its highest, when you are full of peace and joy, there's nowhere else you would rather be and no one else you'd rather hang out with than your spiritual community. It's a very interesting phenomenon, but I don't intend for Mahapatha Yoga or my teaching or any of this to be like a halfway house, or to be, here's how we're going to fix you. Because ultimately, from my perspective, you're not broken. Maybe a little confused, but certainly not broken. And so, again, it's my hope that when you are at your highest, when you are at your most blissful, most peaceful, most realized as a human being, that it would be your choice to want to spend time with me and the Mahapatha Yoga community, to want to come on a retreat. For me, there's no place I would rather be. Even if I became independently wealthy tomorrow, in fact, I would probably teach more if I were independently wealthy, because it would take some of the fetters off. It would allow me to do things that I can't do right now because of finances, money, resources. So ironically, interestingly, I would likely teach more if I had unlimited resources, not less. And that's because this is my passion and my joy. And again, it's not fixing you or any of that. It's the sharing of this flame, of this realization, of this embodiment. It, like I said earlier, I think one of the hallmarks of a true awakening is this desire to share it. And what I've seen in the last few years before the pandemic, as we've done retreats, for several years, and people have come year after year and repeated, and they've deepened their embodiment, their awakening. What I've seen is these people very naturally coming into the role of teacher. Now, that doesn't mean everyone's going to become a spiritual teacher or yoga teacher or make their living doing this. What I mean by that is they very naturally would share their own experience with other students, people who were on the retreat, and you would see the light bulbs go off. And they would say it in a way that I personally wouldn't have said it or couldn't have said it because of their own experience. And this is where you see the universal teacher showing up, and that principle sort of arising within everyone. As the Course says, Course in Miracles says, you're always teaching, whether you know it or not, whether you like it or not. The question is, what are you teaching? So this is what I mean. We're not all going to become yoga teachers. The world doesn't need a whole bunch more yoga teachers necessarily, or even spiritual teachers or non-dual teachers. But awake, embodied people with a high baseline, the world does need that. It needs parents with a high baseline, raising their children and encouraging their children to have a high baseline. Now, again, as I said in this talk, and I said in the last talk, it's not one thing, folks. You're like, well, how do I do that? It's not one thing. Diet, your microbiome, your sleep, your exposure to light, your exposure, your relationship with your devices and media, your relationship with your body, with food, with diet, how much movement you have, your meditation routine, your relationship with your own thoughts and beliefs, your relationship with your shadow, with your unconscious. All of these things are going to affect your baseline. You need to figure out where your baseline lays. Again, if you want to know more about that, view my other talk. That you can deviate from your baseline, but you will always return to your baseline until you change it permanently, or relatively permanently. I'm not saying it can't go up or down, but basically you will rest at a certain level. You want to figure out what that is and be honest with yourself. Is it really high? Do you live normally with a lot of joy and peace and bliss? Are you living in nirvana? Are you living in the kingdom of heaven? If the answer is no, then again, this talk is for you. I'm trying to inspire you. What the world needs from you, what your boss needs from you, and again, your boss might fire you in the process. I'm not saying that people know they need this from you, but they do. They need this from you. They need you awake, alive, embodied, high baseline. All right, everyone. I hope you enjoyed this talk. I hope it inspired you. If you'd like to support me and the work that I do, please check out the links below. Join the Patreon page, subscribe to the YouTube channel, like this video, comment, share. All of these are small ways that you can help spread this message and this word. Again, if there's any way you feel that I can be of assistance to you, as a ordained minister, as a pastor, counseling, inquiry, meditation instruction, what you could call life coaching, anything like that, please reach out and let me know. Otherwise, as usual, everyone, namaste and have a beautiful day.